Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this new episode of our series of webinars, the series that the Observatory of the Indo-Pacific has initiated last year. And we are very fortunate today to have with us Professor Alessio Patalano, who is Professor of War and Strategy in East Asia at the Department of War Studies at King's College, and who has specialized in Japanese naval history and strategy, and of course, other contemporary maritime issues in East Asia. At King's College is based more specifically in the department's Center of Grand Strategy, the War Studies Department Center for Grand Strategy, where he's leading the Japan program. And his research activities are focusing more and more on East Asia and the Indo-Pacific in this key region of the world today. So he will present today his views on the Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific concept, as the title of this webinar says, from concept to practice. Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific from Abe to Kishida, because everything started with Abe, as he's going to tell us. But before we start, I would very much like him to share with us the cover of his forthcoming book that we are all waiting, and that is already available on Amazon and other platforms. So Alessio, the floor is yours for a visual first, and then for the words.
Wonderful, thank you very much. So I'm trying to share the screen with you, and hopefully that should work. Although you should see my screen now. If that's what, yeah, excellent, yeah. Perfect. So that would be what you see on Amazon. The book is coming out with Georgetown University Press, which means that it will be out first in the United States and then by the end of summer in the UK. And it's a labor of love, result of collaborative activity with a pool of international specialists. And it is structured in a way to try to close the gap between the sort of naval strategic studies literature on why navies matter in the Indo-Pacific, and the security studies literature that doesn't really make much of a distinction, or indeed it does sort of recognize the significance of the wider impact of a maritime-centric space in terms of how far navies and maritime forces more broadly sort of affect the dynamics of interactions among states. And we look at it both in terms of historically, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, technology enabled Western European powers to expand their sort of like capacity to reach and to use naval power to influence events in the region, and sort of like historically we trace it down to the present, and then we divide functionally the different parts of the Indo-Pacific into sub-theaters, as it were. And so it's both a historical journey as well as a roadmap on how to process the significance, the relevance, and the impact of naval power in the dynamics of the Indo-Pacific today. But hopefully at the later stage we'll have a chance to do more of this and perhaps even sort of discuss, once the book is out, a little bit more into the details. But that's so far as the conversation, sort of like the reference to your generous pointing out about the book, Christoph. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to the organizers and Mauro and the team at the Global Institute for making this happen. I am very pleased today to engage with the audience over what I call as the transition from the development of a concept, of a vision, which occurred under Shinzo Abe, and that is really the Japanese vision for the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific, to what I think is now under Prime Minister Kishida, a slightly different phase, a phase in which the concept is being bought into. It's a concept that is well recognized, and it's a concept that from a regional and international perspective has also a very clear Japanese branding related to it. So it's no longer about developing the concept, but Kishida-san is now really moving into trying to implement through a specific policies, and in particular was recently announced as the 4 pillars of FOIP, which are a roadmap for the implementation of the concept. And so let me sort of start by doing, I'll do 2 things. One, I'll try to place FOIP into Abe's journey, and the late Prime Minister's journey as a Prime Minister that contributed to redefine Japan's place in the region and internationally. And because that's essential to understand where FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, fits into that, before looking slightly more closely at some of the initiatives undertaken by Kishida-san over the last year and a half or so. And it's important because what really has happened under Kishida is that the strategic circumstances, the broader context has changed. In the UK, the recent, the integrated review and the more recent integrated review refresh have highlighted the sharpening of contestation in international politics. That is something that Japan feels very closely. The Japanese constantly remind their audiences that they are the only country that faces all top state geopolitical challenges of today: Russia, China, and North Korea. So in that sense, the strategic circumstances, the way they have evolved anyway in the last couple of years, provided an important context for Kishida feeling a stronger appetite for moving from that concept development to implementation and delivery of the Free and Open Indo-Pacific idea, vision, initiative, as it was originally conceived by Shinzo Abe. So let me start with the first bit. I'll try to talk for no more than 20 minutes so that we can have a bigger conversation. So this is very much about scene setting. And then, by the way, a lot of what I'll be talking about is also part of my writings. The last sort of more comprehensive assessment of the Abe years appeared in a piece a couple of years ago in Survival, which is really about the sort of grand strategy under Abe and its aftermath. And I have to say that a lot of it, there's a prime minister that has changed, but a lot of what we argued in that article still remains. It's aged quite well, and I think it remained largely relevant for the purpose of our conversation. So the broader sort of background is definitely that piece that I co-authored a couple of years ago in the aftermath of the Abe's years. But let me start first with placing Abe. And it's interesting because the you know, when we're talking about Abe and the Indo-Pacific, we really need to go back to an extent to his very scene-setting visit in India, the speech on the confluence of the 2 oceans that he gave at the Indian Parliament back in 2007. That is very much the beginning of a journey. And it's a journey that sort of continues, notwithstanding the interruption with the change of colors at the helm of the political of the Japanese government during the 3 years with the DPJ. And when Abe comes back in December 2012, he just decided to sort of correct some of the early sort of, if you want, mistakes in terms of direction of travel, but also continue a conversation that really started back in 2006-07 during his first term as a prime minister. And the Indo-Pacific conceptualization really needs to be sort of placed into that initial first stint as a prime minister, because that's the only way to properly sort of process the extent to which he came back in 2012 with a clear sense of the things that needed to change for Japan to deliver a new status for itself, and along with it, a broader conceptualization of what East Asia should look like. Part of the drivers, or certainly one of the key drivers, was two elements really. One is family legacy. Abe comes from what in Japan would be considered, sort of like a political royalty type of family. His grandfathers, both his grandfathers, had been involved into the political process. From maternal side, Kishi Nobusuke has been a tremendous source of inspiration for him. So he always felt very much that he was there on a mission. He had sort of to stand up to the challenges of the day and stepping up to the plate. And I think that's very much what drove him throughout the years. And the other thing is the broader structural changes. So you have an internal, personal, if you want, element to it. And then you got a structural factor, and that is the rise of China, and in particular how China, in the early stages of Prime Minister Abe's second time in power, was starting to forge its own vision for East Asia as a regional system, but also as a region within the broader global economy of the international order. And the development of the One Belt, One Road, which then morphed into the Belt and Road Initiative by 2015, were a key factor in how he felt that Japan had to provide a counter to that vision. And really sort of like, in many respects, this is not just an antagonistic alternative to it. It's a vision that draws upon, if you want, different values, most notably the role that rule of law has in the respect of rule of law in shaping how prosperity comes about, in informing how prosperity is created. But other than that, it's not designed just to be purely antagonistic. In many respects, the Belt and Road Initiative and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative that Japan set out, where these are complementary visions to some extent. What was sort of the main objective? So on the basis of these two drivers, Abe sees the key changes for Japan to become renew its role had to be first internally, domestically. Japan as a country needs to empower itself with the tools or with the frameworks to take advantage of the tools of statecraft fully. And so, for example, a key initiative, the establishment of the National Security Secretariat and the National Security Council, it's absolutely essential because it structurally re-engineers the way in which the implementation of government policy comes about by lifting towards the top, closer to the Prime Minister's office, the capacity to coordinate the different departments of government. And so the National Security Strategy published in 2013 becomes the first manifestation of a document that sits on top of any other document published: economic, defense and security, foreign policy, and so on and so forth. It's the overarching framework, the guide rails, if you want, for then different departments to adapt and adjust. That would, combined with other reforms, which I'm happy to talk about, but really is not necessary to go too much deeply at this stage, are part of this significant structural change. Why does that matter? Because by making that change, Prime Minister Abe ensured that whoever came after him would be in a position to continue to advance the agenda rather than going back. And why do we know that? We know that because back in 2001, when Prime Minister Koichiro Koizumi had provided some significant step change in Japanese foreign and security policy, is capacity to respond to 9/11, sending the destroyers in the Indian Ocean in support of the activities in Afghanistan was very fast. But once he stepped down at the end of the period during which he was at the helm of government, many of these sort of changes were not sort of further capitalized upon. Abe really did want to avoid that, and the structural changes made it possible for someone like Kishida to continue on a path, and indeed to think about the fact we're not just keep talking about initiatives like FOIP, we're going to sort of build upon it proactively. So domestically, this change did make a significant difference. The other thing in which Japan sort of changed under Abe was as a provider of security, not just through the umbrella of the US-Japan Security Alliance, but indeed using that as a launching pad to empower Japan with the capacity to operate with other medium powers within the region and beyond its boundaries. So under Abe, you see very much development of a number of trilaterals and bilateral relations, most notably with Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam to an extent, and in Europe, relationships with countries like the UK, France, Germany, the Netherlands, and even Italy. So, for example, in that sense, a lot that has happened, particularly things like unilateral formations like GCAP, the Global Combat Air Program between the UK, Italy, and Japan. It's a manifestation of something that very much is set in motion under the Abe years, and in particular, set up under the Abe years. It was, I would say, a combination of domestic reforms at the structural level in Japan, and as a result of that, also a rethinking of Japan's capacity to be proactive in international affairs from a security perspective, not just through the alliance with the United States, but using that to empower additional relationship, whether trilaterally or bilaterally, with key actors within the region or outside its boundaries. So these are sort of like the two of the three elements that I mentioned, and the third one really is the coming together of these initiatives under the conceptual framework of the free and open Indo-Pacific. Now, at the beginning, it's called a strategy. Then by 2018, the Abe government and Prime Minister Abe himself called it an initiative. Part of the way in which you explain that change in vocabulary is related to the point I was making earlier. It started off as a vision to counter the Belt and Road initiatives, but by 2017, it's clear to Prime Minister Abe that he doesn't want this to be just an antagonistic, if you want, concepts. And so for that reason, by 2018, you have a conscious change from strategy to initiative in order to accommodate the potential elements of complementarity with the Belt and Road, which in practical terms existed in places like Southeast Asia, right? In places like Myanmar, where literally initiatives under the Belt and Road Initiative were sitting next to initiatives sponsored by FOIP, by Japan's FOIP. Shinzo Abe unveiled the Free and Open Indo-Pacific initiative in 2016 TICAD during the meeting that Japan holds with African countries, and that is not a coincidence. At heart, the vision that Japan is proposing is one in which the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Oceans are the connecting fabric that links together Africa to Asia, and these two continents, for different reasons, are the future of prosperity. Now, that setup highlights 2 points. One, the centrality of maritime affairs to regional order and stability, speaking in terms of both values, rule of law, as well as strategic and military dynamics. How power, soft and hard, is exerted throughout the broader Indo-Pacific, the maritime element to it is absolutely central. So the first 2 things to say is that FOIP is a fundamentally maritime-centric understanding of the world, both in terms of regional order as well as stability. The former talking about governance, good order at sea, and the maintenance of rule of law, the latter about strategic dynamics. The second thing is that how it links this element of the normative behavior and the strategic dimension of it to prosperity. Prosperity in the Indo-Pacific is delivered through shipping lanes and underwater sea cables. And the key element for that to continue to happen in a positive way is by implementing that prosperity by abiding to basic rule of law, respect of rule of law, whether it is transparency when it comes to contracting, whether it is the respect for UNCLOS and the basic principles of the United Nations to avoid the use of force to change the status quo. That's really very much what is driving much of the FOIP conceptualization. It is at heart a maritime-centric, prosperity-led vision for these two continents to ensure a long-term sustainable future for the both of them. In that sense, you can see a number of initiatives that unfold from there that are very much sort of both a manifestation and drivers for such a conceptualization. In the early 2000s, in the late 2000s, so from 2009 onwards, Japan becomes one of the main East Asian actors involved into the international coalition combating piracy off the coast of Somalia and then out in the Gulf of Aden and part of the Indian Ocean. Which again creates the conditions and, if you want, the circumstances for Japan to make a big statement about its contribution to order in the maritime domain. And of course, in addition to that, Japan's economy is inherently linked to shipping and movement of goods and primary resources and materials across the broader Indo-Pacific piece. And it builds also on a long-standing tradition that Japan had already at the time in terms of ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, by giving it a stronger focus. And the FOIP, that idea of connectivity of developing prosperity and the maritime centrality to it leads to a conversation about connectivity. Without connectivity, there is no capacity to create prosperity in that maritime-centric space. And so a lot of the projects that already were part of Japan's broader outreach are in part rebranded, but in part are also sort of reprioritized. So whether it is capacity building to enable different coastal states to implement rule of law, supporting through the capacity building of coast guards by providing them with the tools to introduce better practices, or indeed to provide the tools to actually conduct patrolling. That's one element of dimension. But of a similar sort of space, albeit very different and unrelated to it, it's just helping introducing better connectivity capacity, whether it is the metro system of a large city, or indeed improving port facilities and port conditions. So FOIP becomes this vision that allows the Japanese government to literally re-engineer its different tools of statecraft, assistance, security, as well as, if you want, international standing from a normative point of view, all in a way that is delivered consistently under a unifying framework. So let me look now at the second bit, the one that concerns the Kishida years. As I said at the beginning, Prime Minister Kishida sort of got into the business of running the Japanese government in a context that at a structural level of international relations, it's far deteriorated. And it made absolutely no it means no words around it. A year and a half ago, when the Prime Minister came for his first speech he had delivered at Guildhall in the UK, he talked very much about how, from his perspective, economic prosperity needs to be, that is so central to FOIP, needs to be presented under a framework that leads, that sort of speaks to geoeconomics. The international geopolitical landscape of contestation, whether it is at the structural level between the United States and China, whether it is between China and other actors within specifically the Indo-Pacific region, either India or Japan, or indeed others such as the Philippines. Fundamentally, Kishida's sort of key pitch is that we live in an age that is far more contested and much more competitive driven than we originally anticipated. By 2022, the war in Ukraine just sort of like made that even even sharp, brought that even in sharper relief. And so everything that we approach, even when we're talking about fundamental global challenges to a sustainable prosperity, say sea level rises, climate change, we need to understand that these things will happen and will be needing to be addressed within such a context of enhanced competition and contestation. States and revisionist states, authoritarian regimes in particular, will cooperate with you on these matters insofar as it plays to the strengths of their domestic political constituencies and their ability to continue to govern. Do not raise your expectation far beyond that. And so that is a sense of change, in the sense that it was not as, if you want, it certainly was conceptually already present. The seeds of that idea were certainly present in the original conceptualization of FOIP by Shinzo Abe. But as I said, by 2018, Abe was trying to exploit a lot more the points of convergence with counter ideas such as the Belt and Road Initiative, rather than emphasizing the distinctions. Under Kishida, that changes, and partly is because the structural circumstances of international affairs have changed. But it also leads Kishida to have an opportunity to provide greater clarity as to what exactly is that we're looking at in terms of implementation. And here is where the articulation that occurred this year, just a month ago, when Prime Minister again visiting India, and I think it is not a coincidence that that happened during the visit in India, because in India the FOIP journey started a long time ago, right? And so it is in India that Kishida unveiled the new 4 pillars for the free and open Indo-Pacific. The first pillars concerning principles for peace and rules for prosperity. The second addressing challenges in an Indo-Pacific way. The third, multi-layered connectivity. And the fourth one, the efforts for security and safe use of sea and air in the Indo-Pacific. And it is a list of specific initiatives that, again, do speak to those 4 fundamental factors that I mentioned earlier: a maritime-centric, prosperity-led sort of Indo-Pacific, in which order and stability are sort of go hand in hand. And you see that the first 2 pillars are about how to ensure that order, an understanding of rule of law and what matters about it is clear and it is pursued. And the second one really is linked to the first and the prosperity piece, because it talks about a sustainable Indo-Pacific, the Indo-Pacific way as a specific region that, because of its maritime-centric nature, has a very specific set of issues it has to tackle. It's not just about climate change. It's about the climate crisis and as it manifests itself specifically in the degradation of the marine environment, sea level rises. So the initiatives in that space are very much sort of linking that ordering dimension to prosperity. And the third thing, connectivity, again, physical, soft and hard. We have an articulation. Connectivity now is not just about shipping lanes, port structures, metro stations. It's also about connectivity among people, that sort of people-to-people exchanges, right? Taking that to a step further. The same way the security dimension of that pillar, the stability piece, is now more clearly articulated, both in terms of sea and air stability, and that's perfectly sort of understandable if you think about the fact that over the past, the same way FOIP from a security perspective had been driven by the way in which maritime and territorial disputes were evolving in the East and the South China Sea in the 2010s. In the last 2 to 3 years, we're seeing activities conducted in the air, whether it is the Straits of Taiwan, the East China Sea, or indeed in terms of potential variation of the operational balance of the South China Sea through land-based missile capabilities. It needs, that sort of specific bringing air into the space. It's a reflection of how that sort of higher level of contestation translate in the agenda of things that needs to be done. So it seems to me that just to bring things together and draw towards sort of a final couple of thoughts before we open the floor to the conversation, really when we're thinking about today's Japan and the Free and Open Indo-Pacific initiative, we can't really disentangle it from, or we need to preliminarily go back to how Abe sort of came to think about the importance of a vision, what that meant for his idea of personal legacy, as well as meeting the sort of challenge of a rising China that was outshining Japan when he came back into power, and understanding that journey and place that against the context of a much more enhanced contested international space to see where Kishida-san is today, and in particular how the articulation of these 4 pillars is really very much about seeking to find ways to deliver on a concept that was at heart maritime-centric, prosperity-led, and very much about linking order and stability, starting at sea, from the sea, and now leading into the air in order to maintain and deliver on that promise of a better Indo-Pacific. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Alessio. That was really, in 30 minutes, a tour de force to present this trajectory of the Indo-Pacific from Abe to Kishida, and in a very nuanced and sophisticated manner, we understand fully the keywords and key notions you've analyzed: rule of law, centric attitude, connectivity, revisionist challenges. And I will initiate the conversation by asking a question in relation to this last point, but I invite everybody in the meantime to ask questions in the Q&A box so that we can have the most fluid exchange of views we can have. Yeah, I'd like to, if you want, broaden a little bit the scope geographically by resituating this Japanese approach of the Indo-Pacific in relation to the partners of Japan. And there is one question that I would like very much you to explore. If Japan remains quote unquote ambivalent vis-a-vis China, combining cooperation and competition, or comparative and competitive policies, how is this received in Washington, D.C.? Is it something that is seen as legitimate, perfectionable, even useful, or on the contrary, is it seen as something that is diluting Quad? And you've not mentioned Quad, but clearly Japan is a key player in Quad. And the same question may be reiterated, maybe vis-a-vis Australia, but of course the US is a much bigger player. So yeah, if you could elaborate on this, that would be really useful for us.
Right. So first of all, thank you for raising the question of Quad. I didn't put it in there because I mean, this is part of the multilaterals, right? And Quad is interesting because Quad is one of the spaces where you actually see Quad and CPTPP are very much like the 2 places where you see Japanese leadership beyond the United States to really sort of to see in full fruition, right? Because CPTPP arguably wouldn't exist without Japan, and frankly, Quad in Mark II version, I don't think it would exist without the legwork that the Japanese did, particularly during the years of the Trump administration, especially the capacity and the investment of Japan towards India in developing ties. And Abe was essential. Abe and Modi had a very close relationship, right? When Modi, when Abe passed away, Modi literally felt like he lost a dear friend. And you could see that in the way he reacted to the event, in the way he was present in the aftermath, and in a way he sort of continued to build a relationship with Kishida. And that kind of proximity between Japan and India. And we can have a conversation about the visit that Kishida had in India, you know, to what extent, how close it is, blah, blah, blah. Frankly, it depends where you put the bar. My bar is not particularly sort of high when it comes to how far and how quickly you advance a relationship with India, regardless of the country. But I'd say if in that context, it was remarkable. The fact that they actually managed to coordinate exercises between different aspects of the two militaries as the visit was taking place. This is a sign that both countries are very committed to each other. And you see that, right? And Quad is particularly sort of Japan's capacity to help Prime Minister Modi to find a way to re-engage with India, with Australia. Again, really very important, right? So I didn't mention Quad partly because I was pretty sure that we'll go back to it, and because it falls within the broader brackets of the minilaterals. But it is, as you say, really important. Now, this leads to the broader point about China. Look, so Japan in that sense is not all that different from India when it comes to, like, China is a reality. It's an next door neighbor. It's not that like tomorrow morning I'm going to move the islands of Japan somewhere else, so we don't have a problem. I can just be very naughty with them. It doesn't work that way, right? This is international politics. With the neighboring country with which Japan has had a relationship for several centuries, right? With ups and downs, but it is the sort of relationship that you cannot dispose of. It's absolutely essential. So in that regard, there is a clear understanding that there is no version of Japan's relationship with China that is purely antagonistic. And that's understood everywhere. And I think no sensible person in any capital would turn around and say, oh, no, you know, you really should be just sort of really antagonistic. I mean, China is the enemy. That it just doesn't compute. And I think regardless of who sits in the White House or in Canberra, that is clear. And that clarity, however, does not come with suspiciousness or indeed lack of faith, because Japan has been very clear. The latest national security strategy says that China represents the greatest security challenge Japan has faced in a very, very long time, right? So the clarity of purpose in terms of what is that Japan is not ready to accept in that very intimate and complex relationship, I think it's clear. But the fact that it cannot be a purely antagonistic relationship represents a real asset, because it makes Japan's understanding of China and ties with China an asset for others. And we've seen it during the early stages of the hardening positions between the United States and China under Trump. And in a way, in some respect, even in some in some aspects of the relationship with the Biden administration. So I think Japan has this very important role to play to tune up and down and to modulate, if you want, the broader relationship between the United States and China, precisely because from a Japanese perspective, this cannot be just a one-way picture. It has to be a complex one, and one that its complexity is based on a very intimate set of ties from society, political and historical perspectives that go a long, long, long way back.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Alessio, for this great response. 3 questions have arrived. One by William Reynolds. Hello, Alessio. Really great talk. Thank you. My question is, if we were to place Abe and Kishida within the wider context of their post-1945 predecessors, Yoshida, Ikeda, Tanaka, Nakazone, etc., how would you organize them in terms of how they view Japan's place in the world?
Good question. So I think Abe-san is very much within the. So I think Abe fashioned himself against his grandfather Kishida. I mean, you know, he's got 2 grandfathers. He could have done. I mean, he would have done well with either of them. I mean, the paternal one actually made a big effort insofar as China is concerned. So you could say, you know, in some respect, the other one would have been better. But it doesn't really. It's neither here nor there. Kishi was very keen to bring back Japan as a significant stakeholder in international affairs. And I think there's a lot of that into Abe's thinking about what kind of role Japan should have internationally. But more specifically, I think, even though Abe is drawing inspiration from his maternal grandfather, he's also very much thinking about what he thinks is wrong with the Yoshida tradition. As in particular, as Japan that is, yes, economically strong present, this economic superpower, as it were, or economic power, I think he wants to change, he really wanted to change that. And in many ways it did, right? He wanted Japan to be a comprehensive major power, which is interesting because you also see that in a way Japan contributed to completely rethink the role of G7 in international affairs. G7 not just sort of busy on global challenges, but G7 addressing some of the very, very thorny issues of the day. Kishida was the first one to push for the G7 to adopt the first statements over the East and South China Sea disputes and rule of law and the importance of stability of that. So from my perspective, I would say if you place it into a tradition, he falls very much into sort of like a big Japan, big in Japan, a big time back Japan tradition, of which his grandfather Kishi really was one. But he's also very much different from the Ikeda, Yoshida tradition, in which Japan as a big player is predominantly in economic terms. Is very much about a Japan that is sort of part of an elite group, if you want, and in that sense, through that clubbing, becomes much more rounded, comprehensive stakeholder. So something that is, in terms of ambitions, big, but certainly well beyond what anyone, except perhaps Kishi, had in their heart for Japan to be since sort of the early post-war times.
Great, thank you. And the next question is by Shunak Set. Thank you for your insightful talk. How does Japan's historical legacy impact on interactions with key regional states, e.g. South Korea and the Indo-Pacific framework? Yeah, South Korea needs some special treatment here.
No, 100%. So I think we need to sort of like subdivide, because so you've got two things to, first of all, we need to qualify analytically what it is that we're talking about. Are we talking about the colonial experience as an experience lived by different communities and societies across the broader sort of Asian picture, or are we talking about the political legacy of that imperial experience? Because these are not exactly the same thing. And South Korea is where, in a way, you can see some of the key differences. Because if we talk about the imperial legacy as an experience that societies go through, all components of societies, of course, the components of societies in parts of Asia that suffer the most, whether it is because of the sheer brutality or because of the brutality plus the mistreatment of POWs as well as civilians, it varies. And it varies in different parts of Asia. And it varies not just because the Imperial Army and the Imperial Navy behaved differently in different parts of the empire. It varies also because of when expansion happens. During wartime expansion, the Imperial Army that was leading part of the sort of that legacy, the creation of legacy, if you want, is also being much more brutal about it. So as a general proposition, it creates much bigger troubles from a societal perspective. But also, and that's the third element to this. So we're talking about who was going about, when it was taking place, and what happened afterwards. Because the Imperial Army's sort of really nasty behavior in more places than not, it depends also how you contextualize with whoever comes after. Because in some cases, those who came after were even nastier than Imperial armies. So it's like, yeah, you know, between bad, really, really bad and awfully nasty, there's just a shade. It's all really bad, right? And you see that because across different parts of Asia, you'll see different responses in different societies. in Taiwan or parts of Micronesia, the legacy of the imperial legacy is not seen as terrible, as it genuinely was in parts of China or parts of South Korea and parts of Southeast Asia. So you really need to sort of break it down, right, in terms of experience. And in South Korea, of course, the experience has an enormous amount of shades, of which the question of the comfort women, the women that were forced into prostitution by the Imperial Japanese Army, is one of the darkest elements of that story. But let's not forget that in South Korea, part of the legacy of the Japanese Empire is also the transformation of Korea into a significant economic power during the Cold War, because a lot of the elites that ran the country for the first 30 years of the country predominantly were coming from a Japanese a dissociation from the Japanese sort of industrial conglomerate systems and a bureaucracy that was former imperial Japanese bureaucracy. Let's not forget that President Park, who was one of the main sort of presidents that spearheaded economic transformation in Korea, was himself a graduate of the imperial armed forces, and he was very proud of that legacy and experience. So the experience as lived by communities and societies across Asia, you need to be sort of like start with that, because then it will give you an insight into what aspects specifically the issue. Because in some cases it is an issue, in other cases has been, if you want, a stepping stone towards facilitating reconciliation. Now, separate element to this is the political element of, or the political or imperial legacy is a political element, and that's very much leadership related. So you've got in South Korea, again, really interesting case. President Park in 2015, the daughter of the previous President Park, concluded an agreement with Shinzo Abe, even though she didn't really like Abe all that much, but she wanted to get past that in order to take care of the comfort women. That, as soon as the administration coming from the left after Park came in, rejected that and went to square one and pursued Japanese companies for what's the legal term I'm looking for? Retribution, in wartime retribution to individuals who had suffered at the ends of these companies, right? So in that sense, and also within a particular political constituency, for example, comfort women associations, they have a strong sort of appeal to certain part of the political left in South Korea. So this is not to sort of dismiss the problem itself. It's actually to place the problem in a very important context, that is political. Where does it fit into the broader economy of the relationship between the two countries? And at the human and societal level. And the two not always the same, they sometimes overlap. And when they overlap is when you see really relationship going down. And that's really what, under the Moon administration, the ties between South Korea and Japan were. You had a political instrumental mobilization of what is an outstanding human terrible experience that remains unaddressed. But it's both a domestic thing in Korea as well as sort of like a bilateral dynamics between Korea and Japan.
Yeah, very good. Next question brings us back to South Asia. That was a brilliant presentation, Professor Patalano, says Vignesh. May I request you comment on the possible similarities of benefits that Japan and South Asian countries, including India and Bangladesh, could reap or are looking to reap in their own domestic political turfs?
I'm not necessarily sure I understand common possible similarities and benefits in Japan. Okay. So if I understand the question correctly, what are the advantages of a successful pitch of a regional or a vision for the region, right? And of course you've got at least the emotional element to it, right? The recognition of a status at the regional level, both in terms of an important stakeholders in the shaping of regional order, as well as contributing to its development, right? Domestically, it rewards NGOs, it rewards institutions like the Japan Institute for International Cooperation, or indeed other departments of government, right? So you got that sort of recognition of a status that rewards what it's done, in particular in terms of overseas assistance and development. But that in turn links to a domestic, even more important point about propelling your domestic industry in a broader regional context. I mean, one of the things that I think is very similar is that Japan's investment into developing ties and just going around the region constantly and meeting with counterparts from Southeast Asia, South Asia, South Pacific, it gives you a better understanding of how people think, how people sort of consider and view the value of their body politic and their role in their own countries. And as a result of that, it opens up a better understanding on how your domestic industry can meet the requirements of these places and presents itself in a successful and competitive fashion. That's certainly the case of the Japanese experience. And I think the two cannot be entirely disentangled, right? So there is a genuine domestic benefit. The third benefit, of course, is also in terms of connectivity, increasing connectivity, particularly at the soft level, people to people. Which really it stands in between, if you want, that status recognition and that domestic economic advantage. What is interesting is that in Japan, Japanese remain extremely curious as a general proposition. Japanese students study all sorts of things. Although they tend to travel a little less. I mean, the thing with COVID that is going to be interesting to see how it evolves is the extent to which there is a generational challenge for people to sort of like, roll their sleeve up and go after success by traveling and engaging with other parts of the region, specifically or overseas, as it were. There is a very strong success of Japan as a destination for young people from the region to go and study, to go and live, to try to go and work. So there is a domestic advantage in that, if you want, if anything, in a country that has a significant problems for population, long-term sustainability, and a very low immigration levels, then that kind of success has a domestic repercussion because you're making Japan more appealing for foreigners to come and work there or come and study there. So, and that is something that the Kishida administration, I think, has started to realize that they need to be better at it. And it seems to me these are the sort of the four sort of immediate thoughts that I could have. So that status recognition inside Japan that you're changing. So it changes the responsibility and expectation for your own country. Two, it creates a better people-to-people connectivity with two domestic economic advantages. One, widening of the workforce. Two, making your domestic companies more competitive and attractive internationally.
Yeah, well, that would take me to a follow-up question regarding the competitive dimension of the Japan-China relations, focusing more on Southeast Asia. Is it fair to say that in that part, in this context, Japan intends to compete with China quantitatively by resorting to the ODA in particular, but also qualitatively by saying, well, the kind of infrastructure you can get from us is more robust than what you would get from the Chinese. And as a follow-up question to this follow-up question, what is the role of the corporate sector in the Indo-Pacific plans of Japan? Because in Europe, we are more and more realizing that nothing will really happen if the big companies don't play a role in this policy, Indo-Pacific policy. Well, there are big companies in Japan for sure. Are they following their own strategy independently? How does that fit in the whole story of the Japanese Indo-Pacific strategy?
So two things. One, so the first question was about
ODA plus Yeah, ODA plus the role of quality infrastructure. Is it
Right.
an
Okay.
argument?
Yeah. So I think the emphasis on quality infrastructure has been like a key factor, and in some projects, particularly some African countries and in some countries in Southeast Asia, there has been like a clear demonstration that that difference does matter. I think Tanzania is the latest example where, you know, one would be tempted to go and say like, I told you so, I told you so. But in a way, you know, we moved on from like a debt diplomacy kind of space, and now people are focusing more specifically on look. The reality is that these are just more sustainable. They lend themselves less to corruption of local systems, and therefore they lead to genuine prosperity. So I think, and the quality of the projects, the implementation is just better. So I think that's quite clear. But the ODA point links to this question of the broader companies, because the companies that will be looking at activities overseas, whether it is through the Kendaren, so the main trade association, the research activity and understanding of markets, and interaction with different departments of government to ensure that there is a correlation between what the government wants to do and what would be best for the corporate interest of the the industry sector. They're already there. And there is also JICA as the body that does international cooperation, that has a responsibility to link some of these things together, right? Some of these sort of defense contractors and sorry, not defense contractors, industrial contractors and others. So the delegations, and let's not forget that when Prime Minister Kishida has this large sort of fact-finding missions, there are representatives of industry going with them. So I think the correlation is quite clear. The flow of information also is quite clear. What is less clear, perhaps, is how quickly Japanese legislation is getting adjusted to maximize the capacity of outreach of Japanese companies. In other words, cooperation with others has always been very specific sectors. So these sectors are relatively sort of flexible, but that's not true for other new areas, such as, for example, defense industry cooperation. The capacity to do it collaboratively as well as internationally, not necessarily quite there. So I don't think that the problem is to ensure a flow of information about why the government is coming up with this idea and what this idea should mean for industry. The problem is more about, okay, how are we taking fully advantage of it, and what are the frameworks and the legal structures and provisions that need to change for that to happen. I think that's where perhaps you got more of a mismatch. But other than that, I would say the results of the past few years would suggest that the Japanese have been quite competitive, and they have learned how to present themselves as different from their Chinese counterpart in a way that does not dismiss what the Chinese counterparts do, but it's just like, look, that's different, up to you. And point is like, you see others that went the other way, it didn't work out too well, did it? But so there is a little bit of that, yes.
Very good. Thank you very much, Alessio. Thank you for enlightening us. And we are now waiting for the book that will be available very soon. I think it can be already, pre-ordered.
Pre-ordered, oh my God.
And then read, and that is the most important thing, and commented upon. Yeah, thanks a lot. And
thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks you, Alessio. And we'll have one more session, of course, next month. You'll be aware of, you'll be informed of when and with whom we'll have our next monthly webinar on the Indo-Pacific. Thanks a lot, Alessio, and thank you,
everybody. You, everyone. Thank you, lovely, for the questions.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye now. Bye.